stupid, worthless bitch. Can't you do anything right?
Josh's voice detonated across the dining room like a grenade. And in that single, explosive second, I knew my daughter's marriage wasn't just troubled. It was a carefully constructed cage of terror. But here's what Josh and his manipulative mother didn't know. I wasn't just any concerned parent. I was a woman who had spent 30 years reading the hidden language of abuse, and I was about to dismantle their perfect little horror show piece by piece. They thought they could hide behind polite smiles and neighborhood respectability. They had no idea what was coming. And let me tell you, watching their faces when everything finally collapsed, that memory still brings me a quiet, fierce satisfaction that warms me on cold nights. Before I continue, I want to say something to anyone listening who might be living in a similar shadow. If you're enduring what my daughter endured, please know, speaking up is the bravest thing you'll ever do. Share your story here if you can. Even just tell us where you're from, what city, what state. Sometimes the first step toward freedom is simply saying, I'm here and I matter. You're not alone. We see you. Now, let me take you back to that Sunday afternoon when everything shattered. The rage came over nothing, a fork placed on the wrong side of the plate. That's all it took. One misplaced piece of silverware and Josh erupted like a volcano that had been waiting to explode. His face turned a mottled red, veins bulging at his temples as he slammed both palms onto the mahogany table. The sound cracked through the air, sharp and violent, making the water glasses jump and the china rattle. I felt my entire body go rigid, my breath catching somewhere between my lungs and my throat. But what terrified me most wasn't Josh's fury, it was Amy's response. My daughter didn't look shocked, she didn't look surprised, she looked practiced. Her face transformed instantly into this awful, trembling smile, the kind of smile that's really a white flag of surrender. Her shoulders curved inward, making her smaller, less threatening, less there. And her voice, when she finally spoke, came out in this awful, placating whisper that made my stomach turn. I'm sorry, honey. I wasn't thinking. Let me fix it. The way she said honey, like the word itself was a shield she desperately hoped would protect her, broke something fundamental inside me. I sat frozen in my chair, fork suspended halfway to my mouth, watching this nightmare unfold across from me. The chandelier above us cast warm, golden light on the scene, illuminating what should have been a pleasant family lunch, but was instead revealing itself as a meticulously orchestrated performance of control and fear. And then Lois spoke. Josh's mother sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her domain, her perfectly manicured hand lifting a crystal water glass to her thin, painted lips. She took a delicate sip, set the glass down with precise care, and delivered her line with the casual cruelty of someone who'd said it 1,000 times before. Amy's always been so sensitive, she said, her voice dripping with false concern that barely masked the poison underneath. She takes everything so personally. The way Lois said it so smoothly, so practiced, made me realize this wasn't the first time. This was a rehearsed script, a narrative they'd been building brick by brick to explain away the bruises I suddenly suspected existed somewhere beneath my daughter's long sleeves and high-necked blouses. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Because in that moment, months of ignored warning signs suddenly crashed together in my mind like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place. Amy's increasing distance, the way she'd started apologizing for everything, for calling too late, for calling too early, for having opinions, for existing. The hollow look that sometimes flickered behind her eyes when she thought no one was watching, like a prisoner who'd forgotten what freedom even looked like. The sudden clumsiness that left small bruises on her arms, bruises she'd laugh off with explanations that came too quickly, too detailed, too desperate to convince. I walked into the cabinet. I bumped the car door. I'm just so scattered lately. I'd wanted to believe her. God, how I'd wanted to believe her. But sitting there, watching her hand shake as she reached for that fork, watching her arrange her face into that practiced mask of cheerfulness, I felt something ancient and primal rise up inside me. Something far stronger than fear, far more dangerous than anger. Maternal instinct doesn't just protect. Sometimes it hunts. The rest of the lunch passed in a blur of forced conversation and mounting tension. I moved my food around my plate, barely tasting anything, hyper aware of every micro expression that crossed Amy's face. The way she flinched slightly when Josh reached for the salt. The way her breathing changed, shallow, controlled, careful, whenever he shifted in his seat. She was monitoring him constantly, I realized, reading his mood like someone navigating a minefield and adjusting her behavior millisecond by millisecond to avoid triggering another explosion. When we finally left, Josh's goodbye was all charm and warmth, the perfect son-in-law performance. I hugged my daughter at the door. Her body felt brittle in my arms, like something that might shatter if I held too tight. "I love you, Mom," she whispered against my shoulder, and I heard something in her voice that made my throat close up. It sounded like goodbye. I drove home through the manicured suburban streets, past perfect lawns and picture-perfect houses, and felt rage building in my chest like a wildfire, because I finally understood what I was seeing. An entire community designed to hide violence behind pleasantness, to mistake silence for peace, to confuse a lack of visible bruises with the absence of harm. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated a mother who'd spent 3 decades learning how to read the unspoken language of trauma. They'd assumed my professional distance meant I wouldn't recognize the signs when they appeared in my own daughter's eyes. And they had absolutely no idea about the one name I'd just remembered. A name from a whispered conversation years ago. A woman who knew exactly what this family was capable of because she'd barely escaped them herself. The woman they'd worked so hard to bury, to silence, to erase. The woman I was about to call. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Amy's face transforming into that terrible, practiced smile. The smile of someone who'd learned that her survival depended on making herself smaller, quieter, less threatening. The smile of prey. By 3 a.m, I was sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee and a notebook, writing down every warning sign I'd missed over the past 18 months. The list grew longer with each memory that surfaced, and with each new entry, shame twisted deeper into my chest. How had I not seen it sooner? I'd spent 30 years as a high school counselor, trained to spot the subtle signs of abuse, the flinching, the over-apologizing, the careful monitoring of someone else's mood. I'd guided dozens of teenagers through the recognition of toxic relationships, helped them find their voices, taught them that love should never require you to shrink yourself into nothing. And yet, I'd missed it happening to my own daughter. The irony tasted like rust in my mouth. 3 days later, I called Amy. My hands shook as I pressed her number, and I had to steady my voice before she answered. "Hey, Mom." Her tone was bright, artificially cheerful, the verbal equivalent of that awful smile. "Sweetheart, I've been thinking about Sunday," I said carefully, measuring each word like I was diffusing a bomb. "That moment at lunch when Josh got upset? Mom, please." Her voice dropped to a whisper so quiet I had to press the phone hard against my ear. "It's nothing, really. Josh has just been under tremendous pressure at work. The tech industry is brutal right now, and he's carrying the weight of his entire team." The explanation flowed too smoothly, too rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in front of a mirror, perfecting the inflection, memorizing where to place the emphasis to make it sound convincing. "Amy, honey, I'm not criticizing him. I'm worried about—" "There's nothing to worry about," The brightness was back, sharp and brittle as glass. Honestly, I think you might have misunderstood the situation. Josh wasn't actually angry. He was just passionate about things being done properly. He has very high standards, and I respect that about him. My throat tightened. Every word she spoke was a red flag, and she was waving them at me desperately while insisting they were white. "Sweetheart, can we meet for coffee, just the two of us?" The pause that followed felt eternal. "I don't think that's a good idea right now, Mom. I have so much on my plate, and Josh needs me home. Maybe in a few weeks." A few weeks. The classic delay tactic of someone who hoped the problem would somehow disappear if she just waited long enough. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, feeling that maternal instinct sharpen into something cold and purposeful. If Amy couldn't speak the truth, I would have to find it myself. The next afternoon, I drove to their neighborhood, one of those pristine suburban developments where every lawn was precisely manicured, and every house looked like it had been designed by the same committee that valued conformity over character. The kind of place where people smiled through their car windows, but never actually met each other's eyes. Perfect camouflage for a predator. I parked 3 houses down and watched. Within 20 minutes, I saw Lois arrive, letting herself in with her own key like she owned the place, which I was beginning to understand. She basically did. An hour later, Amy emerged to check the mailbox. She moved differently than I remembered. Shoulders hunched, head down, every movement designed to minimize her presence. She wore a turtleneck despite the warm weather and long sleeves that covered her arms completely. My stomach dropped. When she glanced up and down the street before hurrying back inside, I caught a glimpse of her face. The expression I saw there, hypervigilant, exhausted, frightened, was one I'd seen countless times before, on the faces of students who were surviving situations they couldn't yet name, living in constant terror they learned to call normal. The recognition hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just tension in a marriage. This wasn't stress or miscommunication or 2 people who needed counseling. This was systematic destruction, the slow, deliberate dismantling of a human being. That evening, I did what I'd been avoiding since Sunday. I opened my laptop and began researching. Domestic abuse patterns, gaslighting techniques, financial control, isolation tactics, the cycle of tension, explosion, remorse, and honeymoon period that keeps victims trapped in a psychological maze. Every article I read described my daughter's situation with terrifying precision. The abuser who presents a flawless public persona while terrorizing his victim in private. The enabling family member who spreads rumors to discredit the victim's potential testimony. The community culture that values appearances over intervention, that mistakes visible peace for actual safety. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. A forum post from 7 years ago, written by someone who'd briefly dated Josh before Amy. The post had been deleted, but fragments remained in cached search results. He seemed perfect at first. Then the criticism started. Small things about my clothes, my friends, my job. When I tried to leave, his mother showed up at my workplace and told my boss I was mentally unstable. I felt like I was going crazy. The post ended there, cut off mid-story, erased like it had never existed. But someone had seen it. Someone had tried to warn the world, and that someone had been silenced. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding, and felt something shift inside me, from fear to fury, from confusion to crystal clear purpose. Because I finally understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't just one man's violence. This was a system, a multi-generational pattern of abuse, protected by reputation, enabled by silence, and reinforced by a mother who'd probably taught her son that women existed to be controlled. They'd been getting away with this for years, maybe decades. And they were doing it to my daughter right now, in real time, while I sat here powerless. Or was I? I thought about my 30 years of experience reading trauma, my professional connections, my understanding of how these systems worked, and more importantly, how they could be dismantled. And I thought about that name, the one that had been whispering at the edges of my memory since Sunday, growing louder with each passing hour. Rebecca Hartman, the woman who'd filed for a restraining order against Josh 20 years ago, the woman whose case had mysteriously disappeared from public records, the woman Lois had worked so hard to discredit and erase, the woman who knew exactly what this family was capable of because she'd barely survived them. I opened a new search window, my fingers steady now, my purpose clear. If they thought they could hide behind their perfect suburban facade, they were about to learn something important about mothers whose children are in danger. We don't forgive. We don't forget. And we sure as hell don't give up. Finding Rebecca Hartman became my mission. And I had a feeling that when I finally reached her, I wouldn't even need to explain why I was calling. She would already know. Finding Rebecca Hartman would take time. Time my daughter might not have. So while I searched, I did something that scared me more than I want to admit. I started showing up unannounced. The first 2 times, Josh answered the door with that perfect smile plastered across his face, his voice warm and welcoming as he explained that Amy was resting, that she wasn't feeling well, that maybe I could come back another day. Each time I caught a glimpse of my daughter in the background, her face pale and drawn, her eyes meeting mine for just a fraction of a second before she looked away. The third time changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon, just after 2 o'clock. I'd deliberately chosen a time when Josh should have been at work, when his guard might be down. I parked at the end of the street and walked up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs with each step. Their house looked perfect from the outside. Pristine white siding, flower boxes bursting with carefully arranged blooms, a welcome mat that belonged in a home decorating magazine. The kind of house that screamed, "Nothing bad happens here." But as I approached, I noticed something that made my skin prickle. The front door was slightly ajar, not wide open, but cracked just enough that someone had either left in a hurry or hadn't pulled it completely shut. Through that narrow gap, I could hear voices. Josh's voice, low and venomous, each word delivered like a punch. In Amy's, broken, pleading, terrified. "I'm sorry," she was saying, her voice thick with tears. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to—" "Shut up." Josh's words came out cold and controlled, which somehow made them more frightening than if he'd been shouting. "Just shut your goddamn mouth for once." My hand moved toward the doorbell, but something stopped me. Some instinct that said if I announced my presence now, they'd just compose themselves, put on their masks, and I'd leave having accomplished nothing. So instead, I did something I never thought I'd do. I moved closer to that gap in the door and looked inside. What I saw will haunt me until the day I die. Josh had Amy backed against the kitchen counter, his body towering over hers in a posture of complete dominance. Her arms wrapped protectively around her midsection, her whole body curved inward, like she was trying to make herself disappear. And then I watched him draw back his fist and drive it directly into her abdomen. Not her face, not her arms, her stomach, the perfect place to leave bruises that no one would ever see. The sound of impact was soft, almost gentle. Amy's gasp was barely audible, but the way her body folded, the way her knees buckled and she started to collapse before catching herself against the cabinet, that told me everything I needed to know about how many times this had happened before. My vision went white at the edges. My legs started shaking so violently I had to brace myself against the door frame to keep from falling. Every instinct screamed at me to burst through that door, to throw myself between them, to tear him away from her. But 30 years of professional training kicked in, overriding my maternal panic with something colder and more strategic. If I intervened now, he would know I'd seen. He would escalate.
he would move faster to isolate her completely, and I might never get another chance. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands, I turned on the video recorder, and I captured evidence. Through that narrow crack in the door, I recorded Josh hitting her again. I recorded the way he grabbed her face, forcing her to look at him while he hissed something I couldn't quite hear. I recorded Amy sliding down the cabinet to the floor, her whole body shaking with silent sobs while he stood over her, radiating contempt. And I recorded him walking away like nothing had happened, like he'd just taken out the trash or watered the plants. The entire assault lasted maybe 90 seconds. 90 seconds that felt like watching my daughter drown while I stood on the shore, unable to save her.
When Josh disappeared deeper into the house, I backed away from the door as quietly as I could manage. My whole body was shaking now, adrenaline flooding my system, nausea rising in my throat. I made it to my car somehow, though I don't remember walking there. I sat in the driver's seat for I don't know how long, staring at the video on my phone, watching it over and over again until the images burned themselves into my brain. And that's when I finally let myself cry. Great, gulping sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside me, I didn't know that place existed. Grief for my daughter's suffering, rage at my own helplessness, terror at how close she was to being destroyed completely. But underneath all of that, something else was crystallizing. Purpose. Cold, clear, and absolutely unshakable. Because now I had proof. Now I had evidence of what Josh really was behind his perfect facade. And more importantly, now I knew exactly how methodical and calculated his violence was, which meant he'd been doing this for a long time, probably to other women before Amy. Women like Rebecca Hartman. I pulled myself together enough to drive home, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, my mind racing through possibilities and plans. The video was backed up to 3 different cloud services before I even got out of the car. I wasn't taking any chances with this evidence disappearing. That evening, I finally found her. Rebecca Hartman had left the area 20 years ago and rebuilt her life 3 states away. She'd changed careers, changed her name slightly, Rebecca H. instead of her full maiden name, and had worked hard to make sure Josh's family could never find her again. But she hadn't hidden from everyone, just from them. It took me 6 hours of digging through professional directories, cross-referencing old news articles, and following digital breadcrumbs that most people wouldn't even notice. But eventually, I found a phone number linked to a woman who matched her age, her former profession, and her timeline. My hand shook as I dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. Calm, measured, with an edge of wariness that suggested this woman had learned to be careful about unexpected calls. Hello? I took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass. Rebecca Hartman? My voice cracked on her name. My name is Marielle. I'm calling about Josh. Josh and his mother, Lois. The silence that followed was so complete I thought the call had dropped. Then Rebecca spoke, and her voice had changed entirely. Harder, colder, like steel being forged in fire. What has he done now? 3 words. That's all it took for me to know I'd found the right person. He's married to my daughter. And my voice broke completely. And he's killing her. Slowly. The same way I think you tried to kill you. Another pause. Shorter this time. I'm coming, Rebecca said simply, and I heard something in her voice that sounded like justice waiting 20 years to finally arrive. Send me your address. I'll be there tomorrow. The call ended, and I sat in the sudden silence of my living room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Tomorrow, the woman Josh's family had tried so hard to erase would walk back into their perfect little world, and their nightmare was about to begin.
Rebecca Hartman didn't arrive the next day. Lois did. I was still in my bathrobe, coffee in hand, when the doorbell rang at 8:30 in the morning. Through the peephole, I saw her standing on my porch like she had every right to be there. Perfectly coiffed hair, pearl earrings, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My stomach clenched, but I opened the door. "Marielle, dear." Her voice dripped with false warmth, like honey laced with arsenic. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." She pushed past me before I could answer, her expensive perfume, something floral and cloying, filling my entryway like an invasion. The scent made my throat tighten. "I wanted to chat with you about Amy, woman to woman, mother to mother." I stayed standing, coffee cup gripped so tightly in my hands I thought the ceramic might crack. "We're worried about her," Lois said, smoothing her skirt with manicured fingers. "Josh and I have both noticed some concerning behavior lately." The word concerning came out with rehearsed precision, like she'd practiced the speech in front of a mirror. "What kind of behavior?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral, even though rage was building behind my sternum like a pressure cooker. Lois sighed with theatrical sympathy, tilting her head in that way people do when they're about to say something cruel while pretending to be helpful. "She's been so emotional lately, crying over nothing, making mountains out of molehills." Each phrase landed like a carefully placed landmine. "And between you and me, I think she might be having some mental health issues. Depression, perhaps. Maybe something more serious." There it was, the narrative they were building, the story they would tell if Amy ever found the courage to speak up. She's unstable. She's emotional. She's mentally ill. Don't believe her. I'd seen this tactic before, dozens of times, in dozens of situations. The preemptive character assassination, the careful construction of an alternative reality where the victim becomes the problem and the abuser becomes the concerned caregiver. But hearing it used against my own daughter, sitting in my own living room, delivered by this woman whose son I'd watched brutalize Amy just yesterday, something in me snapped. "That's interesting," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it, "because I've noticed some concerning behavior too." Lois's smile tightened fractionally. "Oh, the way Amy flinches, the long sleeves in summer, the way she monitors Josh's mood like someone trying to predict when a bomb will explode." The air between us turned glacial. Lois stood smoothly, her smile now completely gone, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. "I think you're projecting, Marielle. Perhaps you're the one who needs to examine your mental state." She moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to deliver her final strike. "You should know that several neighbors have mentioned your recent behavior. Driving past their house repeatedly, showing up unannounced. It's bordering on harassment." The threat was crystal clear, even though she was still smiling. "We're trying to protect Amy from unnecessary stress. I'd hate for this to escalate into something legal." She left, closing the door with deliberate gentleness that somehow felt more menacing than a slam. I stood frozen in my living room, shaking with fury and something darker, fear, because I suddenly understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. Lois wasn't just enabling her son's abuse, she was actively constructing a fortress around it, brick by brick, lie by lie, and she'd been doing this for so long she'd perfected the craft.
Over the next 3 days, I saw exactly how effective her campaign was. I ran into Margaret Thompson at the grocery store, a woman I'd known for 15 years, someone I'd considered a friend. When I tried to talk to her about Amy, her face closed down like a door slamming shut. "I think it's best not to get involved in private family matters," she said primly, pushing her cart away before I could respond. 2 other neighbors crossed the street when they saw me coming. At the local coffee shop, I overheard 2 women whispering, their voices low but loud enough for me to catch fragments. "Obsessed with the daughter's marriage? Lois says she's been stalking them."
maybe early dementia? My aunt got paranoid like that. The narrative was spreading like poison through water, contaminating everything it touched. Josh and Lois hadn't just isolated Amy, they'd isolated me too, cutting off any potential support or intervention before I could even organize it. They were reframing my attempts to help as harassment, my concern as mental instability, my evidence as the delusions of an overbearing mother who couldn't let go. It was brilliant and terrifying. That evening, I tried calling Amy again. The phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. I left a message, keeping my voice calm and steady, even though panic was clawing at my throat. "Sweetheart, I love you. Please call me back. Please." She didn't. On the fourth day, Rebecca Hartman finally called. "I'm sorry it took longer than I thought," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation for 2 decades. "I had to pull some old files, get my ducks in a row. You don't confront people like Josh and Lois without ammunition." "They're already moving against me," I said, my voice cracking, "spreading rumors, turning the neighborhood against me. I'm being painted as the crazy, obsessive mother." "Of course you are." Rebecca's tone was matter-of-fact, almost grim. "That's their signature move. They did the same thing to me 20 years ago, told everyone I was a scorned ex-girlfriend making false accusations. Lois went to my workplace and told my supervisor I was unstable and vindictive. What happened? I almost lost my job. I definitely lost my reputation." She paused, and I heard something rustle. Papers, maybe. But I kept every piece of evidence I could gather. Police reports they tried to bury, hospital records, witness statements they paid people to retract. I've been waiting for someone else to come forward, Marielle, because I always knew that I wasn't his only victim. Hope flared in my chest like a match in darkness. "Can you prove it? Can you prove what he did to you?" "I can prove what he did to me. I can prove Lois covered it up. I can prove they used family connections to make evidence disappear." Her voice hardened into something like iron. "And I can prove they've done this before, multiple times. There's a pattern here that's about to become very visible. When can you come?" "Tomorrow. But Marielle," her voice shifted, becoming urgent, "you need to understand something. When I show up, when I bring this evidence forward, they're going to escalate. Josh is going to panic. Lois is going to attack with everything she has. And Amy is caught in the middle." My breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the most dangerous time for a victim is when the abuser realizes he's about to be exposed." Each word fell like stones. "We need to move fast, and we need to be strategic. No more watching from a distance. No more collecting evidence quietly. Tomorrow, we go to war." The line went quiet except for the sound of both of us breathing. "I'm ready," I finally said. "Good, because they have no idea what's coming." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, watching shadows lengthen across the walls. Somewhere, 3 streets away, my daughter was trapped in a house with a man who'd been systematically destroying her for years, protected by a mother who'd perfected the art of making violence invisible. But tomorrow, that protection was going to shatter. Tomorrow, the woman they tried to erase was coming back. And she wasn't coming alone. Rebecca Hartman arrived at my house at 9 o'clock the next morning, and the moment I opened the door, I understood why Josh's family had been so desperate to silence her. She looked like justice personified, tall, silver-haired, with eyes that had seen darkness and refused to blink. She carried a weathered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived decades, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and steady. The handshake of someone who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space a long time ago. "Marielle," she said simply, and her voice carried the weight of shared understanding. We were both mothers, in a way, both protectors, both warriors against the same enemy. I led her to my dining room table, and she opened that briefcase with deliberate care. Inside were folders, dozens of them, organized with the precision of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for 20 years. "Before we begin," she said, pulling out the first folder, "I need you to understand what we're looking at. This isn't just about Josh. It's about a family system that's been protecting abusers for at least 2 generations. She spread documents across my table like laying out evidence at a trial. Police reports with key sections blacked out, hospital records with suspicious notations, witness statements that had been retracted within days, and photos, God, the photos, of a younger Rebecca covered in bruises that made my stomach turn. This was me, 23 years ago. I was 31, dating Josh for 8 months. He seemed perfect at first, successful, charming, attentive. Then the criticism started. Small things. My clothes weren't quite right. My friends were too loud. My job was taking too much of my time away from him. Her voice was steady, clinical almost, but I could hear the tremor underneath, old pain that time had dulled but never erased. The first time he hit me, he cried afterward, begged for forgiveness, promised it would never happen again. She pulled out another document, a handwritten note, the paper yellowed with age. I almost believed him. "What made you leave?" I asked quietly. "I didn't leave. I escaped." She looked up at me and her eyes were hard as flint. Because Lois got involved. She showed up at my apartment one day with this look on her face, part concerned, part calculating, and she told me that if I continued making trouble for her son, she would make sure I lost everything.
Rebecca pulled out a newspaper clipping, faded but still legible. It showed a younger Lois at some charity event, standing next to a man whose name I recognized, a local judge who'd been prominent in the 90s. She had connections, legal connections, political connections, people who owed her favors. Rebecca's finger traced the edges of the clipping. Within a week of filing my police report, I was called into my supervisor's office. Anonymous complaints had been filed about my work performance. My mental stability was being questioned. The restraining order I'd filed mysteriously got lost in the system. "They buried it," I breathed. "They tried to bury me." Her smile was bitter. But I'd learned something important in those 8 months with Josh. I'd learned to document everything. So I kept copies. I kept evidence. I kept every piece of proof I could gather, and I took it with me when I left town. She pulled out the thickest folder yet, and when she opened it, I saw page after page of meticulous documentation. Dates, times, incidents, names of people who'd been pressured to stay silent. Records of how Lois had systematically dismantled Rebecca's credibility. "Why didn't you go public?" I asked. "Why wait 20 years? Rebecca's expression softened with something like sadness. "Because I was alone, Marielle. One woman against a family with power and money and connections. I would have been destroyed." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "But now there's 2 of us. And more importantly, there's evidence from 2 different victims spanning 2 decades. That's not a coincidence anymore. That's a pattern." Hope and terror warred in my chest. "What's our next move?" "We go see Amy." Rebecca's voice turned gentle. "We show her these files. We show her that what's happening to her isn't new, isn't her fault, and isn't something she has to survive alone." "She won't talk to me," I said, my voice breaking. "They've convinced her I'm the problem." "She'll talk to me." Rebecca's certainty was absolute. "Because I'm living proof that you can survive Josh and Lois. And because when she sees these documents, she'll understand that every lie he's told her, every time he's made her doubt her own memory, it's all been done before, to someone else, the exact same way." We drove to Amy's house together, Rebecca's rental car following mine through streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar despite years of driving them. The morning sun was bright and cheerful, making the whole situation feel surreal, like we were about to confront evil in broad daylight while sprinklers watered lawns and birds sang in trees. But when we pulled up to the house, something was wrong. Lois's car was in the driveway. So was a vehicle I didn't recognize, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. Rebecca went very still beside me. "That's trouble," she said quietly. "That's either a lawyer or someone they've called in to help manage the situation." "How do you know?" "Because that's exactly the kind of car that showed up 20 years ago when I tried to press charges." Her jaw tightened.
They know something's happening. Somehow, they know we're coming. A cold finger of dread traced down my spine. Did you tell anyone you were coming here? No one. She looked at me sharply. Did you? I shook my head, but my mind was racing. Had someone seen us? Had Lois been monitoring my house? Or was this just paranoid preparation, the kind of thing wealthy, connected people did when they sensed their carefully constructed lies might be threatened? Before we could decide what to do, the front door opened. Josh stepped out onto the porch, and even from this distance, I could see the cold fury on his face. He was no longer wearing his mask. The charming son-in-law, the perfect husband, all of that was gone, replaced by something raw and dangerous. He pulled out his phone and appeared to take a photo of our cars. "He's documenting us," Rebecca said, her voice tight. "We're going to be the stalkers, the harassers, the crazy women who won't leave his family alone." Then Lois appeared behind him, and the smile on her face made my blood run cold, because she didn't look worried. She looked triumphant, like she'd been expecting us, like she'd already won.
Rebecca's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and the color drained from her face. "What?" I demanded. "What is it?" She turned the phone toward me, and I saw an email that had just arrived, sent from a law firm with a name I recognized as one of the most expensive in the state. The subject line read, "Cease and desist, harassment and defamation." "They filed first," Rebecca said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "They knew we were coming, and they filed a legal complaint before we could even present our evidence." My hands started shaking. "How is that possible?" "Because they've done this before." Rebecca's eyes were fixed on the house, where Josh and Lois still stood watching us like predators who'd just cornered their prey. The front door opened wider, and Amy appeared. But she wasn't looking at me with recognition or hope. She was looking at me with something that made my heart shatter into pieces. Fear, anger, and something worse. Betrayal. Josh's arm wrapped around her shoulders in a gesture that looked protective but I now recognized as possessive. And when Amy spoke, her voice carried clearly across the perfect suburban lawn. "Mom, please leave. You're not welcome here anymore." The words hit me like physical blows. Rebecca grabbed my arm as I started to move toward the house. "Not now," she hissed urgently. "If we approach now, they'll call the police. With that cease and desist, we could be arrested. That's my daughter. And she's been completely turned against you." Rebecca's grip tightened. "Marielle, we need to retreat and regroup. This isn't over, but we can't win this battle. Not today. Not like this." I stood frozen, watching my daughter disappear back into that house of horrors, Josh's arm still around her shoulders like a shackle disguised as comfort. And Lois smiled at me from the porch, a smile of absolute victory. They'd won this round. But as Rebecca pulled me back toward the car, I made a silent promise to my daughter, even though she couldn't hear me. This isn't over. Not even close. The worst part about being cut off from your own child isn't the silence. It's the noise that fills it. For 3 weeks after that confrontation on their lawn, I heard nothing from Amy. No calls, no texts, not even an email to tell me to stop trying. Just absolute, suffocating silence that felt like being buried alive. But I heard plenty from everyone else. The cease and desist letter arrived via certified mail, thick and official and terrifying. Legal language that boiled down to one message: stay away or face consequences. I was accused of harassment, stalking, defamation, and causing emotional distress to Josh and Amy's marriage. The letter made me sound like a monster. Worse, the rumors intensified. Margaret Thompson stopped me outside the pharmacy one afternoon, her face arranged in false sympathy that barely masked the judgment underneath. "Marielle, dear, we're all very concerned about you," she said, her voice dripping with practiced concern. "This obsession with Amy's marriage, it's not healthy. Have you considered talking to someone? A therapist, perhaps?"
I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her until she understood that I wasn't crazy, that my daughter was being systematically destroyed by a man everyone thought was perfect. Instead, I smiled and walked away. Because what else could I do? The isolation wrapped around me like a straitjacket. Friends stopped calling, neighbors crossed the street, even my book club, women I'd known for a decade, suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever I tried to attend. Lois had done her work well, but the loneliness wasn't what broke me. It was the night I drove past their house at 2 in the morning. I couldn't sleep. Hadn't been sleeping properly for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that video on my phone. Josh's fist driving into Amy's stomach, her body folding in on itself, the careful brutality of violence designed to leave no visible trace. So I drove, and somehow my car ended up on their street. The house was dark, except for one window on the second floor, their bedroom. As I watched, a light flicked on, then off again. Quickly. Too quickly, like someone had moved suddenly, urgently. Then I heard it, even through my closed car windows, a sound that will haunt me forever. A scream. Muffled, cut off almost immediately, but unmistakable. Amy's scream. My hand was on the door handle before conscious thought caught up. Every instinct screamed at me to run to that house, to break down the door if necessary, to physically put myself between my daughter and her abuser. But Rebecca's words echoed in my head. The most dangerous time for a victim is when the abuser realizes he's about to be exposed. If I intervened now, with a cease and desist hanging over my head, I could be arrested. And then what? Josh would have complete control, no one watching, no one questioning. Amy would be even more isolated than she already was. So I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, and I did nothing. I did nothing while my daughter suffered behind those perfect walls. The shame of that moment still sits in my chest like a stone I can't swallow.
The next morning, I called Rebecca, my voice raw from crying. "I can't do this anymore," I said without preamble. "I can't watch from a distance while he destroys her. I can't follow legal procedures and wait for the system to work when every day might be the day he goes too far." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard experience. "I know," she said gently. "I felt the same way 20 years ago. The helplessness is almost worse than the fear." "So what do I do?" I was begging now, all dignity abandoned. "Tell me what to do because I'm drowning here." "We wait," she said, and I could hear how much it pained her to say it. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but rushing in now will only make things worse. Josh is feeling cornered, which makes him more dangerous. We need to be smarter than they are." "What if we're not?" My voice cracked. "What if being smart means being too late?" "It won't be." But she didn't sound entirely certain. "Marielle, I'm working on something. I've been in contact with someone from my old investigative unit, someone who owes me a favor and who has the authority to look into this properly. But these things take time." Time. The one thing I was terrified we didn't have. 2 days later, everything got worse. I was at the grocery store when I saw her, a flash of familiar movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, and there was Amy pushing a cart down the cereal aisle. My heart leapt into my throat. She looked terrible, thinner than I'd ever seen her, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. She wore a high-necked sweater despite the warm weather, and her movements were slow, careful, like someone nursing injuries. "Amy!" I breathed, starting toward her. She saw me and froze. For just a second, I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, longing, maybe even relief. Then it was gone, replaced by fear so pure and absolute it stopped me in my tracks. "Mom,
Please, she whispered, her voice trembling, as she glanced around like she expected Josh to materialize from thin air. You can't talk to me. If he finds out. Sweetheart, please, just listen. No! The word came out sharp, almost desperate. You don't understand what you're doing. You're making everything worse. The lawyers, the accusations, showing up with that woman. Her voice broke. He's so angry, Mom, all the time now, and it's because of you. The words hit me like a slap, but I forced myself to stay calm, to remember that this was the abuse talking, not my daughter. Amy, that's what he wants you to believe. He's making you think this is my fault so you won't see that he's the one. Stop! Her voice rose, attracting attention from other shoppers. Just stop trying to ruin my life. She abandoned her cart and practically ran for the exit, moving with the jerky, panicked gait of someone fleeing danger. I stood there in the middle of the cereal aisle, surrounded by curious stares and whispered conversations, and felt my last thread of hope snap. Because Josh hadn't just isolated Amy from me physically, he'd convinced her that I was the threat, that my love was the danger, that trying to save her was actually the thing destroying her. It was gaslighting on a level so complete, so perfect, that my daughter couldn't tell the difference between her abuser and her rescuer.
That night, I sat alone in my dark living room and seriously considered giving up. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe my interference was making things worse, pushing Josh to escalate, putting Amy in more danger than she'd be in if I just stopped. The thought was seductive in its simplicity. Walk away. Let the legal system handle it. Stop fighting. Let my daughter disappear into the house of horrors while I pretended everything was fine. My phone buzzed, cutting through the darkness. A text from Rebecca. Don't give up. I found something. Call me. I stared at those words for a long time, feeling like someone drowning who just spotted a piece of driftwood. With shaking hands, I dialed her number. She answered on the first ring, and her voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before, something fierce and excited and dangerous. Remember how I said Lois made my police report disappear 20 years ago? She asked without greeting. Yes. She didn't destroy it. She hid it. Rebecca's voice was tight with barely contained triumph. And I just found out where, along with 2 other reports from 2 other women, all buried, all hidden, all signed off by the same judge who happened to be Lois's brother-in-law. My breath caught. Can you prove it? I can prove all of it. The falsified documents, the buried reports, the pattern of abuse spanning 3 decades and at least 4 victims. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. Marielle, this is bigger than we thought, and it's about to explode. When? Very soon, very soon. Her voice softened slightly. But I need you to hold on a little longer. Can you do that? Can you stay strong even though it feels impossible? I looked around my empty living room, at the photos of Amy that lined my walls, my smiling, vibrant daughter who'd been slowly erased by a monster wearing a perfect mask. I can, I said, and meant it. For her, I can do anything. Good. Rebecca's voice turned grim. Because when this breaks, it's going to be war, and we need to be ready. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness and felt something shift inside me. The despair was still there, the fear, the crushing weight of helplessness. But underneath it all, something else was growing. Rage. Cold, clear, and absolutely unshakable. They thought they'd won. They thought they had broken me. They had no idea what a mother's love could become when pushed past breaking.
Rebecca Hartman arrived at my house 6 days later, carrying a cardboard box that looked like it had survived an apocalypse. The edges were worn, the tape yellowed with age, and when she set it on my dining room table with a heavy thud, dust motes swirled in the afternoon sunlight streaming through my windows.
"23 years," she said quietly, running her hand across the box's surface like someone touching a gravestone. "I've been carrying this with me for 23 years, moving it from apartment to apartment, house to house, never quite able to throw it away, never quite able to look at it." Her hands trembled slightly as she began pulling out folders. Inside were horrors documented with bureaucratic precision. Police reports with entire sections redacted in thick black marker, hospital records showing injuries that had been coded as accidental, despite their suspicious patterns, witness statements that had been retracted within days, often with identical wording that suggested someone had written the retractions for them, and photographs. God, the photographs. Rebecca at 28, her face so swollen she was barely recognizable. Bruises that painted her body in shades of purple and yellow and sickly green. A split lip, a black eye, finger-shaped marks around her throat. "This was after the third time he put me in the hospital," she said steadily, but her eyes haunted. "I finally got brave enough to file charges. Within 48 hours, the charges were dropped. Insufficient evidence," they said. She pulled out another document, a memo on official letterhead from the district attorney's office, dated 2001. "But I got this through a friend who worked in records. It's internal correspondence about my case." Her finger traced a highlighted section. "The assistant DA recommended prosecution, said the evidence was overwhelming, but it was overruled by someone higher up." "Let me guess," I said bitterly. "Someone connected to Lois?" "Her brother-in-law, Judge Marcus Brennan. He's retired now, but back then he had significant influence over which cases got prosecuted and which mysteriously disappeared into administrative limbo." Rebecca laid out more documents, creating a timeline of systematic corruption that made my stomach turn. 3 other women had filed complaints against Josh over a span of 15 years. 3 women whose cases had all been buried through the same network of connections. 3 women who'd been discredited, threatened, or paid off into silence. Sarah Mitchell, 1998. Restraining order filed and then withdrawn after Lois visited her family. Rebecca's voice was clinical now, detached, the only way to discuss atrocities without drowning in rage. Jennifer Kwan, 2006. Emergency room visit for fractured ribs. Police report filed. Case closed as domestic dispute. Both parties culpable. "Both parties?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "How is that possible when one person is in the hospital?" "Because Josh's lawyer, paid for by Lois, presented text messages where Jennifer had called him names during an argument. They used that to paint her as equally aggressive." Rebecca's jaw tightened. Standard abuser defense. Make the victim share blame for their own assault. The third case was the worst. Monica Herrera, 2012. She was hospitalized 3 times in 4 months. Finally got brave enough to press charges. The night before her court date, she was found dead in her apartment. Ruled a suicide.
The air in the room turned to ice. "You think, I don't know." Rebecca's voice was carefully neutral. "The investigation was minimal. No autopsy, case closed within a week. Her family tried to push for more, but they were immigrants with limited English and no money for lawyers. They got nowhere." She pulled out one final folder, thicker than all the others. "This is what I've been working on for the past month. Documented patterns showing how Lois has systematically covered up her son's abuse for 3 decades. Financial records showing payments to witnesses, communications showing coordination between Lois and her brother-in-law, and most importantly," she opened the folder with something like reverence, "I found the original police reports, the unredacted versions." "How?" "Because I used to work in federal investigation and I still have friends in records departments who know how to find things that were supposed to disappear." A grim smile touched her lips. "And because Lois's brother-in-law kept copies, insurance probably, something to hold over her if she ever became inconvenient." "He gave them to you?" "He died last year. His daughter found them while clearing out his office and recognized my name on one of the files. She contacted me." Rebecca's eyes grew distant. Turns out she never liked her uncle's relationship with Lois, thought it was corrupt. So she decided to make sure the truth finally came out.
I stared at the evidence spread across my table. Decades of abuse, corruption, and systematic silencing laid out in black and white. This is enough, I breathed. This is enough to destroy them. It's enough to start. Rebecca began gathering the documents with careful precision. But we need one more thing to make this airtight. We need Amy's testimony. We need her to add her voice to these other women, to show the pattern continued right up to the present day. My heart sank. She won't talk to me. You saw what happened. She won't talk to you. Rebecca met my eyes, and hers were blazing with purpose. But she'll talk to me, because I'm going to show her something that will change everything. We drove to Amy's house that evening, timing our arrival for when Josh would theoretically be at his weekly poker game, information I'd gathered from his social media posts before he'd blocked me. But when we pulled up, both cars were in the driveway. "He's changed his routine," Rebecca said quietly. "He knows something's coming. He's not letting her out of his sight." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "So what do we do?" Rebecca stared at the house for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "We ring the doorbell, and we see what happens." "They'll call the police, the cease and desist." "Let them." Her voice was hard as iron. "Because I'm about to present evidence of multiple felonies, including obstruction of justice and accessory to assault. That cease and desist won't mean much when they're facing criminal charges." We walked up to that perfect suburban house together, and when Rebecca rang the doorbell, the sound seemed to echo in the quiet evening air. Josh answered, and the look on his face when he saw Rebecca was worth everything we'd been through to get to this moment. Raw, primal terror. Because he recognized her. After 23 years, he recognized the woman he'd tried to destroy, and he knew exactly what it meant that she was standing on his doorstep. "Hello, Josh," Rebecca said, her voice calm and cold as winter. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Behind him, I caught a glimpse of Amy, her eyes wide with confusion and something that looked almost like hope. Lois appeared in the hallway, and when she saw Rebecca, the color drained from her face like water from a broken dam. "You," she whispered, and it sounded like a curse and a prayer all at once. Rebecca smiled, not with warmth, but with the satisfaction of justice 23 years delayed finally arriving. "Yes," she said simply. "Me. The woman you tried to erase. I'm back." She held up the folder of documents, and in that moment I watched the entire facade of the perfect family begin to crack. And I brought receipts. What happened next unfolded with the strange, slow-motion clarity of a dam finally breaking after years of pressure. Josh tried to slam the door, but Rebecca had already stepped forward, wedging her foot in the gap with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd anticipated exactly this response. "You can close the door," she said, her voice carrying through the narrow opening with absolute authority. "Or you can let us in and hear what I have to say before the police arrive. Your choice, but either way, Amy deserves to know the truth." "Amy knows everything she needs to know," Lois snapped from somewhere behind Josh, her voice shrill with barely contained panic. "You're harassing us. We'll have you arrested." "Please do call the police," Rebecca pulled out her phone with deliberate calm. "Because I'm very eager to show them these documents. Especially the ones with your signature authorizing payments to witnesses who recanted their testimony. That's obstruction of justice, Lois, a felony." The silence that followed felt like the world holding its breath. Then Amy's voice cut through, quiet but carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "Let them in." Josh whirled around. "Amy, you don't know what you're— Let them in." Each word dropped like a stone, and for the first time in months, I heard my daughter's real voice, not the trembling, apologetic whisper she'd been reduced to, but something harder, angrier, more alive. Josh's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on his practiced mask of reasonable concern. "Of course, sweetheart, if that's what you want." His hand moved to her shoulder in that possessive gesture I'd come to recognize. But Amy stepped away from his touch.
That small movement, barely a foot of distance, felt seismic.
We sat in their living room, a space I'd been in dozens of times, but now seemed like foreign territory. Everything was too perfect, too carefully arranged, like a stage set designed to convince people that normal, happy families lived here. Rebecca opened her folder with methodical precision, spreading documents across the coffee table like laying out cards in a game of truth. "Amy," she began, her voice gentle but unyielding. "My name is Rebecca Hartman. 23 years ago, I was in a relationship with your husband, and he did to me exactly what he's been doing to you." I watched my daughter's face as Rebecca spoke, watched the careful blankness she'd perfected over months of survival begin to crack at the edges. "That's a lie," Josh said immediately, his voice smooth and confident. "I've never seen this woman before in my life." Rebecca didn't even look at him. She simply pulled out a photograph, one I'd seen earlier but Amy hadn't, and placed it in front of my daughter. It showed a younger Josh with his arm around a younger Rebecca at some social event, both smiling at the camera. Dated September 2001. Josh's confident expression faltered. "This was 3 months before you sent me to the hospital for the second time," Rebecca said, still not looking at him, all her attention focused on Amy. Amy's hands trembled as she picked up the photograph. "And this," Rebecca continued, laying out a police report, "is the documentation from that hospital visit. Note the officer's observations. Injuries consistent with assault. Victim initially reluctant to file charges. Boyfriend present and overly solicitous." More documents followed, each one building a pattern so clear, so undeniable, that even the carefully constructed lies couldn't obscure it. Hospital records, police reports, photographs of injuries, witness statements describing Josh's controlling behavior, his explosive rages, his ability to present a perfect public face while terrorizing women in private. "You're lying," Lois hissed, leaning forward with venom in her eyes. "You're a scorned, vindictive woman who's been stalking my son for decades." "Then explain your signature on this payment authorization." Rebecca slid another document across the table. $2,000 paid to David Chen, who'd witnessed one of Josh's assaults, but mysteriously recanted his statement 2 days later. Your signature, your account, your obstruction of justice. The color drained from Lois's face. Rebecca turned back to Amy, and when she spoke, her voice softened with the understanding of someone who'd survived the same hell. "Amy, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Not for him, not for her. For yourself." She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Has he ever hit you where no one could see?" The silence that followed felt eternal. I watched my daughter's face, watched decades of conditioning warring with the truth she'd been forced to suppress, watched fear battling with recognition, watched denial crumbling under the weight of evidence that made her suffering real and named and undeniable. And then Amy broke. Not in weakness, but in the way a fever breaks, releasing poison that had been building for too long. "Yes," she whispered, and the words seemed to cost her everything. "Yes, always where no one could see. Always where the bruises wouldn't show." Her hand moved to her abdomen in an unconscious gesture that made my heart shatter and reform simultaneously. "He said it was my fault, that I provoked him, that if I just tried harder, learned faster, stopped making mistakes. He said if I told anyone, no one would believe me, that everyone thought we were perfect, that my own mother was mentally unstable and her concerns proved it." Tears streamed down her face, but she kept talking, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. "I believed him. I believed
All of it, because how could someone who looked so perfect, who everyone loved, who was so successful, how could that person be lying when I was the one who felt crazy all the time? I moved before I could think, crossing the space between us and wrapping my daughter in my arms. She collapsed against me, and I felt her whole body shaking with sobs she'd been holding in for years. "I'm sorry, Mom," she gasped against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry I pushed you away. I'm sorry I didn't listen." "Shh," I whispered, holding her tighter than I'd held anything in my life. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. Do you hear me?" Behind us, Josh had gone very still and very quiet, the silence of a predator who just realized the trap had closed around him. Lois stood abruptly, her voice sharp with desperation. "This is manipulation. Can't you see what they're doing? They're turning you against your own family." "You were never my family," Amy said, pulling back from me just enough to look at Lois directly. "You enabled him. You spread lies about me. You isolated me from everyone who might have helped. You weren't family. You were his accomplice." The words hung in the air like a verdict. What followed happened quickly, but with the inexorable weight of justice too long delayed. Rebecca had already contacted authorities before we arrived. By the time Josh tried to leave, 2 police officers were pulling into the driveway, called not just by Rebecca's evidence, but by the video I'd recorded weeks earlier, the video I'd given to Rebecca to add to her mountain of proof. I watched Josh's mask finally, completely shatter as handcuffs closed around his wrists, watched Lois's face contort with rage and disbelief as she was informed she'd be facing charges of obstruction and witness tampering. And I watched the neighbors who'd shunned me begin to emerge from their perfect houses, their perfect facades cracking as they witnessed the truth they worked so hard to ignore.
The legal proceedings took months, but justice, when it finally came, was thorough. Josh was convicted on multiple counts of domestic assault spanning 3 victims and 15 years. The DA called it one of the most clear-cut patterns of serial abuse they'd seen. Lois faced her own charges, and though her sentence was lighter, her reputation, the thing she'd protected above all else, was destroyed completely. But the real victory wasn't in courtrooms or convictions. It was in the counseling center, where Amy, slowly, painfully, began to reconstruct herself, relearning that her thoughts were valid, that her feelings mattered, that she had value beyond someone else's approval. I went with her to every session she wanted me at, holding her hand the way I had when she was small and learning to walk. One afternoon, 6 months after everything collapsed, we were sitting in my backyard watching the sunset. Amy leaned against my shoulder, and I felt the weight of her, solid, real, present in a way she hadn't been for years. "Mom," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something. Anything, sweetheart." "Thank you." Her voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up. Even when I pushed you away, even when everyone said you were wrong. Thank you for knowing the truth when I couldn't see it myself." I turned to look at her, and in the golden light of evening I saw my daughter as she was meant to be. Scarred, but healing. Broken, but mending. Survivor and fighter, and beautiful in her hard-won strength. "I would have walked through fire for you," I said simply. "I would have faced anything, because that's what mothers do for their children. We don't give up, we don't stop fighting, and we sure as hell don't let monsters win." She smiled then, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and lit her whole face. "He didn't win," she said softly. "We did." And sitting there in the fading light, holding my daughter's hand, I felt the truth of those words settle into my bones. The shadow of violence had been long and dark and suffocating.
But the light of truth, when we finally dragged it into the open, was longer, stronger, and absolutely unstoppable. We had reclaimed more than safety. We had reclaimed our voices, our dignity, and our right to live without fear. And no one, not Josh, not Lois, not any abuser hiding behind a perfect mask, could ever take that away from us again.